So let's start with Dan and Sam. We all heard Noah's very long, very researched definition of deterministic TV. What's your perspective? Did he miss anything? Anything you want to add?
I guess my first question, when did that become a word? Is that a thing, deterministic TV?
Today.
Did we just make this up? We do that a lot.
Deterministic, it's more of like a referral word in the dictionary.
And look, I think conceptually it's it's interesting, but I think you have to. I think about it from two ends of a spectrum, right? Or two sides of a coin, maybe a better way to think about it. So on one side, I think your ability to deterministically identify who you want to connect with and who you want to target, right? That's one side of it. The other side, though, is your ability to functionally reach them, and that's where very quickly you get into there's an addressable world and a non-addressable world. And I feel like the second you deterministically identify who you want to talk to, and then when you go to activate, I think it's safe to say it's still deterministic in an addressable world, but the second you leave that, it's not, right? So no, you mentioned the 605 data and a national extrapolation. I would argue the second you extrapolate the data and start to use it for national purposes, it's not deterministic by definition.
You're actually correct.
It happens every now and then.
But you can still deterministically observe who is viewing what and who is observing what
from a measurement standpoint.
And if you're doing that at scale, that has a lot of applications for segmentation that can be used for optimization and so
I'm curious where you land on this.
Hey, I
feel like I'm in the middle of some crossfire.
That's why we put you in the middle.
I think about it as known versus inferred. And as a national programmer at Discovery for 30 years, what we really knew about our audience was on an anonymized basis, age, gender. And today...
And inferred from a panel.
Inferred from a panel. And today, through our affiliate agreements, we actually have access to known exposures on set-top boxes, where they know that person, they know what they've watched, and we've been utilizing that. We were early into the game on attribution. We've been using that set-top box for 3 years now, and so I think for us, it's really, allowed us to open up, scalable attribution solutions, which is an area of focus for us.
So that's a good segue. So attribution obviously is key. The TV industry has been slow to react to it. I think we've generally caught up with great, suppliers like 605. Doesn't feel like that's the end game, though, right? Deterministic data used to forecast, deterministic data used to plan and optimize and activate seems like it's the next big frontier. Maybe talk about sort of each of your vision of what needs to happen in an optimal world, combining linear and addressable together.
No, I think that's the exact right way to think about it. So I want to be careful that as an industry, there's been a ton of lip service given to this idea of a pure deterministic world, which I think is right. It just will never happen, right? You're never going to have perfect census level measurement of everything.
It would require your parent company and the rest of the cable ecosystem to play along very nicely.
Potentially, but so again, that's where, Howard, you describe sort of this middle ground that's really important. Right, which is this idea where starting with deterministic data, right, to better match and map audiences, and then start to layer in predictive analytics and potentially even extrapolation methodologies. I think at the end of the day, that's where you get to this hybridized world, frankly, that we're at and can do today. Right, like that's the important thing. Again, as an industry, we spend a lot of time complaining about everything that's wrong and all the stuff that's not perfect. We need to accept the fact it will never be perfect, just make it a little bit better. So again, I love the idea of starting with deterministic data, using forecasting and modeling. It's a big part of what we're doing. We do it today using DirecTV data, right? So we can actually match segments deterministically into that data set, extrapolate it to a bigger population. And then on the attribution front, we can even take deterministically measured and calculated attribution and build forecasting models on top of it so that we can actually predict where and when to put advertising spots, right? Where and when to put your 30-second spot to drive the highest conversion. I would argue that stopped being deterministic, but it works really, really well.
Right. So Sam, what's the Discovery view on that?
Yeah, I think for us, we're trying to figure out how do we take all these great learnings we've had from the deterministic data on the attribution side and funnel that back in to the front end of the targeting process. To date, it's been kind of a separate exercise when we discuss targeting and then use the deterministic data on the attribution. How do we get a closed loop cycle that's feeding responsive audiences from that deterministic view with a hybrid of whatever we need to get that back into the nationally representative plans that we're building.
But you guys, though, you need to solve for the planning part of it too, right? Because you're in a world where you can't afford to waste an impression. And, you know, the wasted impression could be someone watching who is 20 exposures on CNN linear TV, and they get a couple of exposures on CNN digital.
Yeah, look, it's a challenge, but frankly, it's also an opportunity, right? And it's the most overused quote in our industry, but I'll do it again. It's that John Wanamaker quote, we know half the media is not working, I just don't know which half. I think we now have better data. We can start to understand which half is working and which half isn't. The question is, how quickly can we get to a point where we can drive more precision in terms of how we're actually planning and optimizing so that we're extracting theoretically as much value out of the impression as possible. Right? And I think there's a world in which, in a purely addressable world, that's a lot easier. But until we get there, predictive analytics do a much better job than what we've done historically.
Yeah.
Just to add to that, deterministic data, it is not a means to an end. And deterministic data today, unless you have 100% of the U.S. population, it's not going to work, which is why you have to apply the projection methodologies. But deterministic data activation allows us to do things on television that historically have been very hard to do. What is the point of taking a data set composed of 5 million data points or 5 million individuals and matching it against 120,000 panelists? There isn't much of a point with doing that. But what deterministic data activation allows us to do is it allows these media companies, and I used to work at a media company, to be able to sell in new ways, to plan in new ways, to optimize in new ways, and of course measure and attribute.
Sure. Okay, let's talk a little bit about attribution. This will be something I harp on at every one of these events when I'm moderating. But look, we have great measures of what happened. I think you could argue that we have pretty bad understanding of why what happened, right? I'm sure Macy's sold a lot of mittens and scarves and gloves yesterday, right? Because it was subarctic weather in November. Where do you think we are, or what needs to happen to get us disciplined to understand we got this outcome, understand what the drivers are beyond exposure, so that we have better variables to use in optimizing next time?
I'll jump in first.
And is that a valid concern for the industry?
So a couple of things. So I think attribution today, I think everybody's doing a lot around attribution. I think the biggest problem is scale, right? We're not doing any of it at scale, right? And I think unfortunately that's just an effect of the ecosystem as it exists today, right? The attribution marketplace today, you have a handful of vendors who I think have really good solutions, but they are cobbled together from lots of different third-party data sets that they have to pay for and license, that they in turn then charge advertisers, agencies, and media companies for. A typical attribution study that we run for a specific campaign costs $30,000 to $120,000 for one campaign. If that's $1 million campaign and we have to spend $100,000 to measure it, that will never scale. And in order to do what you're talking about, right, to actually start to make it predictive so that it can drive true activation and optimization, we need to do it at scale, right? So I honestly think the state of the industry today and sort of this ecosystem of vendors who are, again, none of it is at scale, none of it is always on, almost makes that impossible. That's why and it's a double-edged sword because you do want a third party involved, but we sit on a lot of set-top box data. We just started to build the damn thing ourselves, right? So we're using our set-top box data. We're using data that we're collecting through our 170 plus million consumer relationships with an AT&T to do that. And since we own all of the data in that value chain, we can now effectively start to do it faster, at scale, and certainly cheaper. But that's what's necessary.
Yeah, I'm glad you asked that question. I think, we're in a lot of conversations around outcome-based guarantees and things like that. And our position has been we just don't have enough of that understanding or benchmarks around what's driving these numbers to really start guaranteeing on that. And I think we all have to take a step back and understand one step deeper around what's driving some of these outcomes. And if the same audience is seeing the same creative across a bunch of networks, then what really is the differentiator in that outcome? Yeah. And that's what we're trying to understand, and we're working with vendors and talking obviously to agencies about helping us together to understand that.
In terms of scale, there's obviously cost and the ability to be able to affordably scale. But another way of looking at scale is how big is the universe sample that you're looking at for attribution. And so 605 and Discovery, we actually worked together and conducted what we believe is the largest sample base for a linear attribution study ever performed in the United States. And it covered more than 40 million households, looking at each and every single household from an ad exposure perspective, and performing not just lower funnel attribution, but also a brand lift survey combined with it all in one study. And this is what 605 thinks is the future of attribution.
Yeah. The only thing, and I think you sort of touched on it, Sam, is you have, if you think about the riches of the industry, you have T-Vision measuring attention and in the room. You have Bill Harvey with driver tags. You have Transform with an AI version of context. I mean, I think one of the things the industry could benefit from is sort of a meta study that says which one of those matter to driving outcomes and which one of those could actually be planned against to run through all your businesses.
So the cool thing is 605 is already integrated with the Bill Harvey RMT driver tags that essentially describe context. From a psychographic perspective, and the bigger your TV viewership data set and having 100% household level matching rights allows you to essentially overlay lots of things. Yes, there's going to be some amount of modeling taking smaller sets, but that's the beauty of DTV, if you will.
There we go.
Can we just, before you go to the next question, just the guarantee piece I think is interesting, and Dave touched on it before. There is this big push as an industry to guarantee on outcomes. And I think it's interesting, but I would actually argue that the guarantee aspect of that is probably the least interesting, right? That's just someone's appetite for risk. It probably comes as a surprise to everybody, but media companies tend to under-deliver on deals.
No.
Incur liability.
No.
That happens from time to time.
No.
So if we guarantee attribution, again, it's just what our appetite for risk is in changing the metric. Yeah. Sure, there needs to be some level of confidence and stability in it, but I feel like we're falling to this trap of just rushing towards, well, just make that the guarantee. The real thing is where you were going. How do you functionally optimize? How do you make a different decision? Because your spot's actually better here versus here. I put it here, 3 people go to the restaurant. I put it here, 2 people go. Put your spot here.
Right. Well, and sort of the Venn diagram intersection of here is a deal that maximizes your yield, but also maximizes the outcome for David's client.
The economics have to work, right?
Yeah.
Dave is spot on when he said it. At the end of the day, to do all of this, we're going to expect to get paid more money for this unit versus that unit. The difference is the math that Dave highlighted has to work. Yeah. It has to be that much better for the advertisers so that their ROAS functionally goes up. I would argue CPMs theoretically could go down. They get more for their money, we get more for the unit. That's the only way this works. Otherwise, it's not worth to do it.
So do we have to, and I think last question, do we have to stop using the word currency? I mean, are we moving into a world where when we think about currency, it's Nielsen panel, MRC accredited, slow, old, and should we really be thinking about the focus? And I think Noah, you sort of touched on it around transparency, accuracy, and understanding. I mean, someone called me up a couple of weeks ago and said they had gotten a reach and frequency for a TV schedule, 100 GRPs across 13 weeks, rated by an ACR provider, and the reach was 50 and the frequency was 26. And they said, well, what do you think of that? And I'm like, well, it feels low, but who the hell knows? So, I mean, do we need to change our focus and not talk about currency, because currency puts us in the linear world, and really it is all around sort of what you described of here's how you predict, here's what you're doing to edit your data, here's how you integrate set-top box and ACR. Why don't you start, Noah, and then?
Currency is evolving. There is the legacy currency, But as we embrace new technology, more data, and as television becomes more integrated, not just linear, but looking at linear, DVR, set-top box VOD, not just C3, not just C7, not limiting your VOD metrics at 28 days, but there's a lot of stuff that happens after 28 days, and then being able to link that up with everything that's happening in the connected TV world, the concept of currency as it exists today ceases to work, and we have to evolve.
I wish I had the Merriam-Webster dictionary that you looked up deterministic, but I'm guessing if I looked, it would say a currency is when two parties agree to transact on a particular measure. And so I just feel like it's going to come that point where we're comfortable enough with the benchmarks and the methodology and standards across the industry where we're going to get to that. There are going to be multiple currencies.
Yeah, look, I think both I think are spot on. I guess the one thing that I would just sort of maybe add to it is, look, as an industry, we're sort of at an inflection point. So I fully embrace the idea of different and many different currencies, right? And we do that today in our business. We have hundreds of $1 millions that are transacted outside of Nielsen C3 today. And they're on advanced data sets, they're on set-top box data, and everything in between. But we need to be really, really careful, because bigger isn't always better. And at the end of the day, just because you can count doesn't mean it's going to be a viable currency, right? And I think we need to be careful as an industry and really, hopefully, develop some common sense point of view on this, because I've seen a lot of great set-top box data. I've seen a lot of bad set-top box data. I've seen a lot of good ACR data. I've seen a lot of bad, and everything in between. What I don't see, and unfortunately this is across the board, I don't see a lot of strong voices who truly understand media research, media currency, who can actually speak to those differences today. We have ripped that out of this industry, and that's a really, really scary thing.
The one thing currency sort of implies is it's an open book. The buyer and the seller can see the same data. The same data that you guys are using to plan, Dave's using to plan. Do you think there's willingness in the marketplace to make the data sets available to the buy side in an anonymized way, so it actually can serve as a trading metric, not currency?
Well, that's absolutely 605's plan, and we source our data from Charter, as well as Frontier and Inscape, and our intention is to be able to support both the buy and sell side with all these applications, and to provide the currency grade projections, so that it makes sense. But information symmetry is key for the future health of this marketplace.
Hugely. Anything to add, guys?
I think it's a question for more of the holders of the data.
Yeah, look, absolutely, the data needs to exist in both places. It also needs to exist in scalable, economically viable ways, right? I think as an industry, we all love to bash Nielsen, but I see our P&L and I understand what our margin is on our Nielsen C3 business. It's very high. I see it when we use other data, 605 potentially included in that. Those margins are much smaller. That's a problem. That's got to get fixed.
All right. Thank you, guys. Great conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you.